The snow began to fall early that evening, thicker and faster than anyone had expected. A fierce blizzard had been forecasted, but the storm came with an urgency that caught the whole town off guard. By the time it was dark, roads were buried in white, and it became clear that leaving wasn't an option. For Sarah, a newcomer to the secluded town, it was only her second winter here. She'd rented a small cabin on the outskirts, surrounded by thick pines, and as the howling wind picked up, she couldn't shake an unsettling feeling that something was watching her from outside. The cabin had its quirks. The floors creaked even without footsteps, and the windows rattled no matter how securely they were locked. The locals had warned her that the woods could play tricks on the mind, especially during winter, and that no matter what she heard outside, she should never open the door. The forest keeps secrets best left alone, they had told her. Sarah had laughed it off then, but now, alone in the cabin, she began to question their strange warning. As the night deepened, a scratching sound echoed from outside her window. It was subtle at first, like branches brushing against glass, but it grew louder. Sarah's pulse quickened as she tried to reassure herself that it was just the wind whipping through the trees. She forced herself to ignore the sound, but soon it moved to the door, a slow, deliberate scratching. She froze, her gaze fixed on the wooden door just a few feet away. She could hear her own breath, quick and shallow, as the scratching turned into knocking, soft but insistent. Every instinct screamed at her not to open it. The knock continued, rhythmically, and then stopped. She felt a momentary relief, but it was fleeting. Sarah felt something even more chilling, the unmistakable sensation of eyes on her, as though someone or something were staring right through the walls. The knocking returned, but this time it was joined by something even worse, a voice, whispering her name in a raspy, unnatural tone. It sounded close, too close, like it was right outside her door. "Sarah, let me in." Panic took over. She backed away from the door, clutching the knife she had grabbed from the kitchen counter. She knew she couldn't stay near the door, so she darted to her bedroom, locking the door behind her, feeling a false sense of security within those thin walls. The whispers outside grew louder, spreading throughout the cabin as if something was moving from window to window, circling her, testing her resolve. Hours passed, or maybe just minutes. It was impossible to tell. The whispers eventually faded, but Sarah couldn't bring herself to leave the bedroom. She huddled in the corner, fighting the fatigue that tugged at her. At some point, she must have drifted into an uneasy sleep because she woke to silence. The storm had quieted and a pale, gray light was seeping through the window. She hoped the night had been nothing but a nightmare. But as she slowly opened the bedroom door, her blood ran cold. The cabin was eerily quiet, the calm before something unspeakable. She tiptoed into the living room, gripping her knife tightly. The front door hung slightly open, snow drifting inside, and something in the snow made her stop in her tracks. Footprints. Not human ones, but long, narrow, clawed marks that started from the open door and led in strange loops around the room. They looked like nothing she had ever seen before, almost as if they were made by hands rather than feet, hands that dragged along the floor, leaving deep grooves in the wood. Her mind reeled, trying to rationalize what she was seeing, but nothing made sense. Sarah's eyes followed the tracks, and her heart sank as she noticed where they led, to the spot where she had been sleeping. The clawed prints circled her bed as though something had stood over her, watching while she slept. She felt bile rise in her throat, and her hand shook as she tightened her grip on the knife. Suddenly, the front door slammed shut on its own, and the sound echoed in the stillness. A chill deeper than the winter cold settled into her bones. She turned, slowly, to face the door, and saw it. A figure, impossibly tall, shrouded in shadow, with eyes that gleamed like ice. It had no face, just those eyes, locked onto hers. She couldn't move, couldn't breathe, as it took a slow, deliberate step toward her. "Sarah?" it whispered, its voice sounding like wind scraping over frozen ground. She felt the cold seep into her, deeper and deeper, as though it were draining the warmth from her very soul. She took a step back, but it mirrored her, never breaking eye contact. Without thinking, she turned and ran, crashing through the back door into the woods. The snow was up to her knees, but she stumbled forward, desperate to put distance between herself and the cabin. The cold was brutal, biting into her skin, but the terror of what was behind her pushed her onward. She could hear it moving through the trees, the whisper of her name growing louder, and she realized with sickening dread that it was toying with her, letting her run just far enough to give her hope before it closed the distance. She tripped and fell, landing face first in the snow. As she tried to push herself up, she felt a cold hand wrap around her ankle, yanking her back. She screamed, her voice lost in the empty, snow-covered forest as she was dragged backward. She clawed at the ground, kicking wildly, but the grip was unbreakable. In that moment, she remembered the townspeople's warning. No matter what, never open the door. Her vision blurred as the cold took over, her body numb, her thoughts fading. The last thing she saw was a dark figure standing over her, its ice-blue eyes the only warmth in the endless winter night. The search for Sarah began the next morning. The townsfolk found her cabin, the door open, snow scattered inside. They found her footprints leading into the forest, but halfway through the woods they stopped abruptly. There was no trace of where she had gone or what had taken her. Some say that on stormy winter nights you can still hear her faint screams in the wind, echoing through the pines. And if you listen carefully, you might hear a whisper, barely audible, calling her name, or yours, warning you to keep the door closed. The storm had rolled in without warning, with thunder so loud it shook the ground beneath his feet. James was miles from home, and the narrow forested road had turned black in the heavy rain. The town he was passing through looked like it had been deserted for decades. Empty storefronts, peeling paint, and crumbling buildings lined the streets. Every single window seemed to stare at him as he drove through. There was no sign of life except the lightning splitting the sky and the trees bending in the furious wind. But he had no choice. His car's gas gauge was low, and he hadn't seen a station for hours. Just as he thought he'd have to turn back, a dim light glimmered up ahead. A single gas station stood at the edge of town as if left behind from another era. He pulled in, relieved, even though everything about the place made his skin crawl. The fluorescent lights inside flickered erratically, and the air smelled faintly of something rotten. But he was desperate, so he stepped out into the rain and made his way to the pump. As he lifted the nozzle, he noticed movement inside the station. A man stood behind the counter, pale and motionless, staring directly at him. James gave a polite nod, but the man didn't react. His gaze was unsettling, his eyes wide and unblinking. James shrugged it off, reasoning that people in isolated towns like these sometimes had strange habits. He quickly filled his tank, then walked into the station to pay. The man still hadn't moved. He was stiff as a mannequin, his mouth twisted into a smile that seemed forced, almost painful. Up close, James noticed something else. The man's skin had a grayish tint, almost waxy, like he wasn't entirely alive. "How much do I owe you?" James asked, but the man didn't respond. He just kept smiling, his gaze fixed on a spot just over James's shoulder. The silence stretched on, thick and uncomfortable. James took a step back, unnerved, and was about to leave cash on the counter when something caught his eye. Behind the counter, a mirror hung on the wall, facing the register. In the mirror, the man wasn't smiling. He wasn't even looking at James. His eyes were wide with terror, his mouth frozen in a silent scream, his hands clutching the counter like he was trying to hold on for dear life. James's heart pounded as he looked from the mirror back to the man in front of him, whose face remained frozen in that forced, unsettling smile. Sweat prickled his skin despite the chill of the storm outside. He took a step back, but just as he did, he heard a faint, desperate whisper that sounded like it was coming from the mirror itself. "Help me." Every instinct told him to run, to leave whatever was happening in this place far behind. But he was rooted to the spot, his gaze locked on the terrified reflection in the mirror. He took a shaky breath and looked around, hoping to find some other explanation. The gas station was empty and silent, the aisles lined with dusty shelves and faded products. Gathering his courage, he forced himself to speak. Are you okay?" he asked, his voice barely more than a whisper. The figure behind the counter remained perfectly still, that awful smile frozen in place. But in the mirror, the man's face contorted in horror, and his mouth opened wide, a soundless scream filling the room. The reflection moved, even as the man himself did not, his hands clawing at the glass as though he were trying to break through. "Please, don't leave me here." The whisper drifted to James again, this time louder, echoing from nowhere and everywhere at once. A deep, Guttural growls suddenly filled the station, coming from somewhere in the darkness behind the counter, and the reflection's eyes widened further, filling with an unmistakable fear. James staggered backward, his stomach twisting with terror. His body screamed at him to run, but he was frozen, transfixed by the unfolding nightmare. The growling grew louder, the air heavy with the scent of something vile and rotten. Shadows began to coalesce behind the man in the mirror, twisting and writhing like something alive, something hungry. Suddenly, the lights in the station flickered, and the man's frozen smile shattered, his mouth opening as though controlled by some invisible force. His head twisted at an unnatural angle, eyes rolling back until only the whites showed. James stumbled back, his breath caught in his throat as the man, or whatever it was, whispered in a voice that didn't sound human. "You can't leave now." As if on cue, the door to the station slammed shut with a force that shook the entire building. James ran to it, desperate to escape, but it wouldn't budge. He pulled and kicked, but it felt like the door was welded shut, trapping him inside with whatever lurked behind the counter. Panic surged through him as the lights dimmed further, the shadows thickening until they seemed to swallow the room. He glanced back at the mirror, and in it he could see the man, now a twisted, grotesque figure with hollow eyes and a mouth stretched wide, almost inhumanly so. Behind him the shadows grew into a shape, a monstrous, clawed figure with glowing red eyes, watching James with malevolent intent. The creature began to speak, a low, rumbling whisper that clawed at James's sanity. "You will take his place." As the words registered, James felt a cold hand on his shoulder. He spun around, but no one was there. The room was empty, save for him and the figure at the counter, still frozen in that ghastly, distorted smile. He backed away, his body pressed against the unyielding door. Trapped. The lights went out completely, and the only illumination came from the faint glow of the mirror, where he could see himself, staring wide-eyed, while the shadowy creature moved closer, closer. Then, the mirror image shifted. The man behind the counter was gone, and in his place, James saw himself, staring back, frozen in a smile that wasn't his own. He screamed, pounding on the glass, as he realized with dawning horror that he was trapped. Inside the mirror, inside the gas station, his face fixed in a twisted grin as he watched his own body walk back out into the storm, leaving him behind forever. Outside, the storm raged on, and the gas station sat silent once again, the only sign of life, the faint glow of a figure in the window, smiling, eternally waiting for the next unlucky soul to stumble upon it. It was a cold, brittle winter night, and Thomas was exhausted. He had spent hours driving through the snow-covered countryside, hoping to reach his destination before midnight. His sister had told him the cabin was just an hour past the old timber town, but he'd taken a wrong turn somewhere and ended up on a winding, unmarked road that twisted deeper into the dark woods. Eventually, his car skidded to a stop when he saw an eerie, unlit building standing at the edge of the trees. It was a large house, much older than the log cabins he'd expected, with a roof that sagged under the weight of thick, wet snow. The windows were dark, empty, giving the place a haunting, hollow appearance. But he didn't have much choice. The snowstorm was worsening, and his gas tank was almost empty. He approached the house, and to his surprise, the front door opened as he reached for it. The smell that hit him was stale and earthy, like soil and rotting wood. Inside, the air felt dense, pressing in around him, but he saw a faint glow coming from further inside, from what looked like a living room with an old crackling fireplace. The warmth was inviting, so he stepped further in, closing the door behind him. As he walked deeper into the house, he noticed how quiet it was, the kind of silence that made his ears ring. He called out, "Hello? Is anyone here?" But his voice seemed to vanish into the walls. The room was furnished in a style that looked decades old, with dark leather armchairs, faded wallpaper, and shelves filled with dusty knickknacks. He settled into one of the chairs by the fire, feeling the tension ease from his shoulders. As the warmth from the fire seeped into his bones, he almost drifted off, but a strange sensation washed over him, like he was being watched. He opened his eyes, and for the first time, he noticed a peculiar detail. Photographs lined the walls. Old, sepia-toned portraits of people from another time. Each one showed a solemn face staring directly into the camera, and he felt an odd chill as he scanned their faces. Then he noticed something that made his blood run cold. One of the pictures showed a man who looked exactly like him. He stood up, heart pounding, and stepped closer to the portrait. The resemblance was uncanny. Same dark hair, same sharp jawline, same hollow eyes. And beneath it, in small ornate lettering, was his own name, Thomas Carter, 1894. His breath caught as he felt an unnatural cold spreading through the room. He looked around, and his eyes landed on a mirror over the mantel. In it, his reflection was barely recognizable. His skin looked pale, almost translucent, and his eyes had a dark, sunken look as though he hadn't slept in weeks. He took a step back, but his reflection didn't move. It stared at him, a small, chilling smile stretching across its face. Panic gripped him, and he bolted for the door, but the hallway seemed to stretch, growing longer with each step. Shadows flickered at the edges of his vision, moving and shifting like something alive, reaching out for him. He glanced behind him and saw figures emerging from the darkness, pale, translucent, their faces twisted in expressions of silent agony. They wore clothes from different eras, some Victorian, some more modern, but all of them had the same dark, haunted eyes. He sprinted, his feet pounding against the wooden floor, but no matter how fast he ran, the front door seemed impossibly far away. The walls around him felt like they were closing in, the air thick with the smell of mildew and decay. Just when he thought he couldn't go any further, the floor suddenly gave way beneath him, and he plunged into darkness. He landed hard, dust and grime filling his mouth and nose as he lay in what felt like a basement. The dim light from a single hanging bulb illuminated rows and rows of shelves, each lined with jars and small boxes covered in dust. His eyes adjusted to the gloom, and he saw what was inside them, personal items, things like rings, watches, and pocket knives. He reached for a small box and opened it, revealing a tattered wallet with a photograph inside. It was of him, his sister, and their parents, taken years ago. The realization hit him like a punch. Somehow his own belongings had been here all along, waiting for him. He stumbled back, his eyes frantically scanning the room, and he saw other items, each with a label beneath it, names written in delicate cursive handwriting. Thomas's gaze fell on a nearby shelf where he saw an old locket inscribed with the name Eleanor Tully, 1923. The names went on and on, each belonging to someone who had vanished into this place, into this house. As he turned, he felt a cold hand on his shoulder, and he spun around to find himself face to face with his own reflection again. But it wasn't just a reflection, it was him, his doppelganger, twisted and distorted, eyes hollow and mouth stretched in a grotesque smile. "Welcome home," it whispered, its voice layered with many others, a cacophony of voices that seemed to resonate from the walls, the floors, from the very air. The room began to shake, the shelves rattling, and the bulb above flickered violently. The shadows gathered around him, closing in until all he could see were those dark, haunted faces, each one an echo of a soul trapped here before him. He stumbled back, reaching for the stairs, but his legs felt leaden, like he was moving through water. The air was suffocating, and the walls seemed to pulse with life, as if the house itself were breathing, feeding off his fear. And then with one final flicker, the light went out. For days, weeks, or perhaps years, time lost all meaning. Search parties combed the snowy woods for any trace of Thomas. His car was found abandoned on a nearby road, the driver's seat covered in a thin layer of frost as though it had been sitting there for decades. But the house itself was never found. Local legend holds that on certain winter nights, when the snow falls heavy and the air is thick with mist, people still catch glimpses of a light in those woods, just out of reach. And if they listen closely, they can hear the faint sound of footsteps and whispers, desperate voices calling for help, and sometimes, just sometimes, the echo of a name, Thomas Carter, carried on the wind before fading into the endless silent night. The blizzard swept across the mountain with a fury, and Melissa knew she was in trouble. She had planned a peaceful, solitary weekend at an old cabin she'd rented far off the beaten path, miles from the nearest town. But the snowstorm hit without warning, leaving her isolated and trapped. By evening, the snow had piled up past her windows, and her phone had no signal. She was completely alone, or so she thought. As she gathered firewood in the cabin's cramped living room, she noticed something peculiar on the old wooden floor. There were footprints, faint but distinct, trailing from the doorway to the center of the room. Her own prints were still fresh and led from the fireplace to the woodpile. But these other prints were older, marked in a light dusting of what looked like ash, and they were too large to belong to her. Melissa's heart pounded. She stared at the footprints, following them to a spot just a few feet away from where she stood, where they stopped as if whoever left them had simply vanished. Trying to shake off her unease, she stoked the fire and locked the door. But as the night wore on, the cabin began to feel strange. She could hear faint creaks in the walls as if something were shifting, settling. Then came a soft, rhythmic tapping on the window, like fingertips pressing against the glass. Melissa's pulse quickened as she glanced outside, but all she saw was the snow, endless and white, obscuring everything. She turned back to her book, trying to ignore the sounds. The tapping grew louder, moving from one window to the next. She told herself it was the wind, maybe a loose branch, but every so often she would catch movement out of the corner of her eye, a shadow in the corner, a flicker in the firelight. Her breath caught each time, and she'd look around, finding nothing but the empty room. Around midnight, she heard it, a voice, muffled, almost imperceptible, whispering from somewhere close. She froze, every muscle tensed, and listened. It sounded like someone murmuring her name, softly, insistently. "Melissa, Melissa, come outside." She stood up, trembling, and searched the cabin. It was small, just a single room with a kitchenette, a bathroom, and a small bedroom, all covered in a fine layer of dust. No one was there, yet the voice persisted, calling to her from beyond the walls. "Melissa." She moved toward the window, peering into the swirling snow. For a moment she saw nothing but white, until a dark figure emerged just beyond the cabin, barely visible. It was tall, almost unnaturally so, with long arms that hung awkwardly by its sides. Its face was obscured, shrouded in shadow, but she could feel it staring at her. Her breath fogged the glass as she watched it, unable to move. She felt drawn to it, almost hypnotized, as it raised one long, thin arm and beckoned her forward toward the door. Then it vanished, blending into the storm. She stumbled back, her heart racing, every instinct screaming at her to leave, but there was nowhere to go. Outside was nothing but snow and freezing darkness. Trying to ignore her terror, she barricaded the door with a chair and dragged her sleeping bag into the bedroom, where she curled up, hoping the dawn would come soon. But the night was long, and sleep was impossible. The whispering grew louder, and sometimes it wasn't just her name. It was pleading, almost begging her to come outside, its tone shifting from gentle to insistent, to desperate. She covered her ears, but it did no good. The voice seemed to penetrate her mind, wrapping around her thoughts, filling her with a creeping dread. Around 3 a.m, she heard footsteps. They were slow, heavy, and they circled the cabin, moving from window to window, as if searching for a way in. Her stomach twisted as she heard them stop right outside her bedroom window. She held her breath, straining to hear over the pounding of her own heart. And then, from directly outside the window, the voice whispered, louder and clearer than before, "Melissa, please, let me in." She squeezed her eyes shut, praying it would go away. But the voice continued, growing in urgency, pleading, coaxing. And then, in a moment of weakness, she glanced at the window. The figure was standing inches from the glass, its face pressed against it. Pale, ashen skin stretched over sharp bones, hollow eyes staring directly at her, and a wide, unnatural smile frozen on its face. Its mouth moved, but its voice didn't match the movement. It was a distorted echo, a sound that came from everywhere and nowhere, reverberating in her skull. "Come out, Melissa. Come out." She pulled the covers over her head, trembling, and whispered to herself, "It's not real. It's just the storm, just the wind." But when she dared to look again, the figure was still there, unmoving, watching her as if it could see through the walls. She stayed frozen in place, every second stretching into eternity, until finally the whispering stopped. The silence was so complete, so sudden, that she almost believed it was over. Then she heard the door creak open. Her heart seized as she realized that, despite locking it, despite the chair she'd shoved against it, the door had opened. She could hear the faint crunch of footsteps on the floorboards, slow and deliberate, coming toward her. She clenched her fists, barely able to breathe, as the steps grew louder, stopping just outside her bedroom door. The doorknob twisted, rattling as it strained against the lock. She held her breath, feeling the oppressive weight of its presence on the other side. And then, in that horrifying silence, she heard it, low and guttural, whispering from just beyond the thin door. "Melissa, I found you." The doorknob twisted once more, and with a final soft click, it unlocked. She closed her eyes, whispering a silent prayer, waiting for whatever nightmare lay behind the door. But there was only silence. She dared to open her eyes, and the door was still shut, the room still. For hours, she lay in her bed, paralyzed with fear, until the first weak rays of dawn broke through the frost-covered window. When morning finally came, she cautiously stepped out of her room. The cabin was empty, quiet, the door still barricaded as she had left it, her own footprints the only sign of life on the dusty floor. The night felt like a fever dream, a nightmare she couldn't shake. But as she packed her things to leave, her heart stopped at the sight of the floor just outside her bedroom door. There, in the thin layer of dust, were footprints, large, ashen prints that began at the door and stopped just before her bed. And scratched into the wood beside them were the words, "I will wait for you to come back." Emma had never believed in ghosts or spirits, but when her grandfather passed away, she inherited his small, lonely farmhouse deep in the countryside. The land was beautiful but remote, surrounded by a thick forest that seemed to swallow sound. She arrived just as a winter chill set in, feeling a strange excitement at the idea of starting fresh, even if she'd be alone. The farmhouse was old but sturdy, its wooden floors creaking under her footsteps, the air smelling faintly of cedar and age. The only odd feature was an antique mirror in the hallway, something she'd never noticed on past visits. It was ornate and large, stretching almost floor to ceiling, with an intricately carved wooden frame. She glanced at herself in the mirror, shivering at the way her reflection looked slightly distorted, as though the glass was warped. On her first night, a light snow began to fall, covering the landscape in an eerie quietness. She settled into bed, listening to the wind when she heard the first sound, a faint scraping coming from somewhere down the hall. She sat up, her heart racing, and strained her ears. Silence. She dismissed it as the wind, telling herself that old houses made strange noises, and forced herself to sleep. But the noise returned every night. Sometimes it was a soft tapping, like fingers drumming against glass. Other times it was a long, slow scrape, as though something sharp was being dragged along the floor. Each night she grew more unnerved, her nerves fraying as she convinced herself it was just her imagination. On the fourth night, as the noise returned, she finally decided to investigate. She crept down the hall, her bare feet silent on the cold floorboards, and stopped in front of the mirror. The air around it was colder, as if the mirror itself was drawing in the chill from outside. She stared at her reflection, feeling the strangest sensation that her mirror image was waiting. She turned away, but as she walked back to her room, she heard a faint, raspy whisper echo from the mirror. "Emma." She froze, her breath catching in her throat. The voice had sounded like her grandfather's, old, gravelly, but unmistakably his. She tried to shake off the feeling, telling herself it was only in her head. But as she lay in bed, she kept hearing it, faintly, her name being called over and over again. When she finally drifted off, her sleep was filled with nightmares. She dreamt of walking into the mirror and finding herself in a dark, distorted version of her house, a place where shadows seemed to have a life of their own, reaching out to touch her. She woke in a sweat, gasping, her skin clammy with fear. The following morning, she examined the mirror more closely, running her fingers over its cold surface. But then she saw something that made her heart pound. A faint, smudged handprint, far too large to be hers, pressed against the inside of the glass. She wiped at the mirror, but the handprint didn't fade. It was as if it were part of the glass itself. That night she couldn't sleep, so she sat in the living room, the soft glow of the fire the only light. The mirror was just visible down the hall, reflecting the shadows that danced on the walls. She watched it, telling herself she'd leave in the morning, that the house was playing tricks on her mind. Just as her eyes grew heavy, the fire dimmed, and she noticed movement in the mirror. A shadow, darker than the others, moved within it, twisting and contorting as if it were trying to escape. Emma sat frozen, unable to tear her gaze away. She could see a shape forming in the mirror's glass. A face that looked disturbingly familiar. It was her own. The reflection was staring back at her, but this time, it wasn't mirroring her movements. Her mirrored self tilted its head, a slow, unnatural motion, a small, knowing smile curling at its lips. Then it lifted one hand and pressed it to the glass, as if beckoning her closer. Emma stumbled back, her mind racing. She could see her own face in the glass, but her real self wasn't smiling. The mirror image's eyes were dark, almost empty, filled with an intent that felt foreign, malevolent. She glanced away, heart racing, but when she looked back, the reflection was still smiling, closer now, as if it had somehow leaned forward without her noticing. And then it mouthed words, silently, that sent ice through her veins. "Let me out." The fire died completely, plunging the house into darkness. She heard the whisper again, her own voice echoing in the empty house, coming from everywhere and nowhere. "Let me out, Emma." She bolted from the room, locking herself in the bedroom. Her phone had no signal, and she was left alone in the quiet darkness. She didn't sleep that night, listening instead to the faint tapping from the mirror, the soft, insistent whispers that grew louder as dawn approached. When the first light broke, she packed her bags, deciding to leave immediately. But when she approached the mirror one last time, she saw her reflection there, smiling, a little too wide, a little too knowing. And beneath her reflection, a single word was scratched into the glass, faint but unmistakable. "Stay." The following day, the farmhouse sat empty once again, the snow piling up around it. The mirror stood in the hallway, reflecting the silent rooms, and if anyone had been there to look closely, they might have seen faint smudges on the glass, shaped like hands, pressing from the inside. The locals had always warned people to stay away from Blackwood Forest, especially in the winter. But Jessica was a thrill seeker, a paranormal blogger who prided herself on exploring places with unsettling histories. She had planned her trip for months, drawn by the rumors surrounding the forest. There were stories of people disappearing, strange lights, and whispering voices. She thought it was the perfect way to end her year, documenting the mysteries of Blackwood. It was already late in the day when she arrived, with only a few hours of pale sunlight left. The trees were thick, twisted in unnatural shapes, their branches stretching like skeletal fingers toward the gray sky. Snow clung to the boughs, muting every sound. The silence was unnerving, even for her, but she pushed the feeling aside. Her flashlight cut through the gloom as she made her way into the trees, camera in hand. As she walked deeper into the forest, she noticed that the light was fading faster than it should have. The trees grew denser, almost seeming to lean in closer, their branches clawing toward her. The temperature dropped sharply, and an eerie stillness set in, as if the forest were watching her. Jessica forced a laugh, whispering to herself that it was all part of the experience. But every step she took felt heavier, as though the snow were pulling her down. After about an hour of wandering, she noticed something strange on the ground. Footprints, almost fresh, leading off the trail. They were large and deeply pressed into the snow, as if someone had been dragging something behind them. She followed the tracks, feeling her pulse quicken with curiosity. But as she went further, the tracks suddenly stopped. There was no sign of a struggle or a change in direction. The footsteps simply vanished. Jessica took a few more cautious steps forward, shining her flashlight around. The air was so still that her breath formed clouds that hung in the air longer than seemed natural. Then she heard it, a faint, distant voice just on the edge of hearing. "Jessica." Her heart stopped. She hadn't told anyone she'd be here, hadn't seen another soul since she left the car. She brushed it off, deciding it was the wind carrying her name, but the voice came again, clearer this time. "Jessica, come closer." Against her better judgment, she followed the sound, every instinct screaming for her to turn back. The whispering grew louder, filling her mind, leading her deeper into the forest, where the trees grew so thick they blocked out the sky entirely. She felt like she was walking in a tunnel, her flashlight casting long, strange shadows that seemed to move on their own. Then, ahead of her, she saw it, a dim light flickering in the trees. She pushed forward, drawn to it, thinking perhaps it was a campsite or another explorer. But as she drew closer, the light didn't become clearer. It grew stranger, darker. It was cold, pale, and it illuminated nothing around it. It was almost as if the light itself was alive. When she finally reached it, she gasped. In the middle of a small clearing stood an old wooden cabin, barely visible through the mist. She hadn't seen it marked on any map and couldn't imagine why anyone would build out here. But as she stood there, a sinking dread filled her. The light seemed to be coming from within, flickering like a weak, unnatural flame. The cabin's door hung slightly ajar, creaking in the breeze. She took a step forward, peering inside, but the moment she crossed the threshold, the door slammed shut behind her. The air was thick and stale, filled with the smell of rot and something metallic like blood. Her flashlight flickered, casting erratic beams around the room. The walls were covered in deep scratches, as though something with long, sharp claws had tried to claw its way out. She turned to leave, but the door wouldn't budge. Panic set in as she pulled and pushed, but it was no use. Just then, she heard a faint sound, like soft sobbing, coming from somewhere deeper within the cabin. "Hello?" she called, her voice barely more than a whisper. The sobbing stopped abruptly, replaced by silence. Then came the sound of footsteps, slow and deliberate, pacing just beyond the wall in front of her. Her flashlight finally steadied, and she shone it into the corner of the room, illuminating a small mirror hanging on the wall. It was cracked, its surface covered in dust. Yet, as she looked closer, she saw a faint, shadowy figure standing behind her in the reflection. Heart pounding, she spun around, but the room was empty. The mirror, however, showed something else, a dark, hunched figure with hollow eyes, its mouth twisted into a grin that stretched too wide, too wrong. The figure raised one hand and placed it on the mirror from inside, pressing against the glass, its fingertips smeared with what looked like dried blood. Jessica staggered back, dropping her flashlight. The cabin plunged into darkness, but the figure in the mirror remained illuminated, as though it had a light of its own. She heard it whisper, her own name echoing softly in the confined space. "Jessica, let me out." The voice grew louder, desperate, pleading. She could feel something pulling her toward the mirror, an unnatural force wrapping around her, drawing her closer. "Help me, Jessica." She could feel herself reaching out, almost involuntarily, her fingers brushing the cold glass of the mirror. The figure's grin grew wider, its hollow eyes widening with anticipation. With a jolt, she pulled her hand back, her mind racing, telling her to leave, to run, to get out any way she could. She kicked the door, throwing her weight against it until finally, with one last push, it gave way, and she stumbled into the snow, gasping for breath. As she turned back, she saw the cabin was gone. The clearing was empty, as if it had never been there. All that remained were her footprints leading up to an empty space in the snow. She ran through the trees, her heart racing, her mind reeling. When she finally reached her car, she drove away without looking back. The image of that twisted, grinning face burned into her memory. Days later, she reviewed the footage from her camera, hoping it would prove to her that what she'd experienced wasn't real. But as she scrolled through the photos, her blood ran cold. In each shot of the forest and the dark spaces between the trees, she could see it, her own reflection, staring back at her from within the woods, smiling that same twisted, empty smile. And at the end of the footage, there was a single video file she didn't remember recording. It showed her sitting alone in the dark cabin, staring blankly into the camera. And then, in a voice that wasn't quite her own, she whispered, "I am waiting for you." The video ended with the sound of soft, slow laughter, echoing from somewhere deep within the trees. The night was silent as Marcus pulled into the old inn on the edge of town, relieved to find a place to escape the snowstorm. It was a small, forgotten establishment tucked away in the woods, and only dim lights illuminated the place. The sign out front, Lakeview Inn, creaked in the wind, barely visible beneath the snow and ice that clung to it. Inside, the place was surprisingly warm, though eerily quiet. A small bell on the counter summoned the innkeeper, an elderly woman with sharp eyes and a thin, tight-lipped smile. She barely spoke as she handed Marcus an old-fashioned metal key, and he noticed how cold her hands were, almost as cold as the air outside. Ulrun. His room was on the top floor, a quaint, old-fashioned space with a large antique bed and a cracked mirror above the dresser. Outside the window, the blizzard raged, snow piling high against the window. The room's light cast long shadows on a daft, making the place feel even more isolated. Marcus told himself that the quiet was a good thing, just what he needed for a night of rest before continuing his trip. As he unpacked his bag, he noticed a faded newspaper clipping on the desk. The article, yellowed with age, was about a family that had disappeared from the area years ago. No bodies were ever found, but the last place they were seen was rumored to be Lakeview Inn. He shivered, brushing it off as a creepy inn story, and turned in for the night. Around midnight, a faint creak stirred him from his sleep. He lay still, listening, convinced it was just the old building settling, but then he heard it again. Footsteps, slow and deliberate, outside his door. He sat up, heart pounding, and waited. The footsteps stopped, followed by a soft knock on his door. He hesitated before calling out, "Hello? Is anyone there?" Silence. He opened the door cautiously and peered out into the hallway. It was empty, stretching down into darkness, and he could see that all the other doors were closed tight. He shut the door quickly, telling himself he was imagining things, that he was just tired. But the moment he turned back toward the bed, he felt it, the unmistakable sensation that he was being watched. Glancing around, his eyes fell on the mirror above the dresser. In the dim light, he could see his own reflection, but something was off. His reflection seemed slightly out of sync, almost like it was lagging behind, moving just a fraction slower than he was. His heart pounded harder as he stepped closer, squinting to see if it was just a trick of the light. And then his reflection smiled. Marcus stumbled back, terror rooting him to the spot as he watched his reflection stand still, smiling even though his own face was frozen in horror. The smile was wide, unnatural, stretching far too much, with a glint of something sinister in its eyes. The reflection lifted its hand slowly, pressing it against the inside of the mirror, and he watched as his own distorted image began to mouth words he couldn't hear, whispering something he was too scared to comprehend. He forced himself to turn away from the mirror, trying to shake off the feeling, but a wave of dread washed over him. He backed up toward the door, ready to flee the room, when he heard it again. The footsteps, now louder, approaching down the hall. The footsteps stopped just outside his door, and then without warning, the knob began to twist. Panic, Marcus threw his weight against the door, holding it shut. Whoever or whatever was on the other side began to knock, softly at first, then louder, each knock echoing through the room. "Let me in, Marcus," a voice whispered from the other side, a soft, cold voice that sounded so familiar it chilled him to his core. It was his own voice. The knocking stopped. Silence filled the air, heavy and suffocating. He slowly moved away from the door, but as he did, he caught movement in the mirror. His reflection was standing by the door, still smiling, watching him. "Why are you scared?" it whispered, its voice low and mocking. "Don't you know? You're already in here with me." Marcus backed up further, his eyes darting between the door and the mirror. The reflection began to laugh softly, the sound growing louder, filling the room until he thought his head might split from the noise. He grabbed his bag and darted for the door, tearing it open and fleeing down the hallway. The inn was dead silent, but he didn't stop to wonder where everyone else was. He just wanted to get out. He stumbled down the stairs, his mind racing, convinced that he could still hear his own voice echoing in his head, mocking him. As he reached the front door, he found it locked tight, the latch jammed as though it hadn't been opened in years. He looked around desperately, seeing no one, not even the innkeeper. The entire place felt wrong, empty, as if it had been abandoned for ages. Just as he was about to break the glass in a panic, he heard it again. That familiar voice, his own voice, whispering from somewhere deep inside the inn. "You can't leave, Marcus. You belong here now." He froze, every hair on his body standing on end. Slowly, he turned back toward the stairs, feeling compelled to look to see what was waiting for him. Standing at the top of the stairs was his reflection. Only this time, it wasn't a reflection. It was him, identical in every way, staring down at him with that same twisted smile, dark and hungry, its eyes glinting with malice. The figure raised a hand and beckoned him forward, its grin widening. "Come back upstairs, Marcus," it whispered. "It's so much warmer here." He backed away, that heart pounding, until he felt his back press against the door. His eyes never left the figure at the top of the stairs. It took a step forward, slow and deliberate, as though savoring the fear radiating from him. In desperation, he closed his eyes, gripping the doorknob and whispering under his breath, praying to be let out, praying that this was just a nightmare. When he opened his eyes again, the figure was gone. The inn was silent, the air thick and still. And then he heard his own voice, soft and sinister, whispering directly behind him. "Leaving so soon?" The cold hand touched his shoulder, pulling him back into the darkness. When Lucy's aunt passed away, she inherited a grand old mansion that had been in the family for generations. The house was a sprawling, ivy-covered structure filled with countless rooms, hidden staircases, and windows that rattled in the wind. Her aunt had lived there alone for as long as Lucy could remember, and she always described the house as full of memories. On her first night in the mansion, Lucy decided to explore. The storm outside howled through the cracks and crevices of the old place, and every footstep echoed down the empty halls. Each room was stuffed with antique furniture and dusty portraits of family members whose eyes seemed to follow her wherever she went. She remembered her aunt's stories of relatives who had once lived in the mansion and died there, but she brushed off the thought, chalking it up to old family lore. Then, as she made her way up to the attic, she saw it. An old oak door at the end of the hall, far older than the rest of the house. It was locked, and she felt a strange thrill just looking at it. She searched through her aunt's things and eventually found an ancient, rusted key hidden in an old book. The key fit perfectly. The door creaked open, revealing a dusty, dimly lit room lined with walls of books and strange artifacts from all over the world. In the center was a single, tall mirror covered by a dark, heavy cloth. For reasons she couldn't explain, Lucy felt an overwhelming sense of dread just looking at it. But curiosity got the better of her, and she pulled the cloth away, revealing a tall, polished mirror with an intricate gold frame. It seemed out of place, somehow grander than the room itself. She stared at her reflection, marveling at the odd sense of distortion, as if she were looking at herself from a distance. And then, without warning, her reflection moved. Just a slight tilt of the head, something she hadn't done herself. She stepped back, heart pounding, but her reflection smiled, a slow, knowing smile that filled her with a chill. She turned to leave, but her own face in the mirror twisted with a look of rage, then faded back to normal when she looked again. She convinced herself it was just her imagination. But that night in her room, the unease wouldn't leave her. The storm outside grew stronger, battering against the windows, and just as she was about to drift off, she heard it, a faint knock on her bedroom door. "Hello?" she called, her voice shaking. No response. She waited, her heart thundering, but all was silent. She turned back over, trying to calm herself, when she felt a cold breeze wash over her, far too cold for an old house like this. She looked up, and there, at the foot of her bed, stood her reflection. It was exactly like her, but wrong. The figure's hair was disheveled, her eyes hollow, her face bearing a twisted smile that Lucy would never make. She felt frozen, paralyzed, unable to scream as her own likeness slowly stepped forward, a mocking look in her eyes. The figure leaned down close to her, whispering in her own voice, "Thank you for letting me out." With that, the figure disappeared, leaving Lucy trembling. She convinced herself it was a nightmare, a product of her overactive imagination and the stress of the new house. The next day, she went back to the attic, determined to cover the mirror again, to put it out of her mind. But when she entered the room, the mirror was gone. Frantically, she searched the entire house, but it was as though the mirror had never been there. Yet as she walked back through the halls, every reflective surface she passed, a window, an old photo frame, a glass cabinet door, seemed to contain a glimpse of that twisted reflection, lurking, waiting, and watching her. As night fell, she heard the knock again, louder this time, echoing through the empty house. She tried to ignore it, but then the whispers began, faint but unmistakable, filling every dark corner of the mansion. They grew louder, calling her name, relentless. And then in the reflection of her bedroom window, she saw herself again, her twisted, grinning reflection, mouthing words she couldn't quite hear, but could somehow feel deep inside. "I'm here now, and I'm not leaving." She could barely sleep, her nights filled with flashes of her own face and strange, unnatural expressions that haunted her dreams. Over the following days, her reflection continued to appear in every reflective surface, closer and closer each time, as if trying to break free. It wore an expression of pure malice, lips moving soundlessly, mocking her. She avoided mirrors, avoided looking at herself at all, but the figure was relentless. Finally, in desperation, she took down every mirror in the house, shattering the ones she couldn't remove, until the mansion was bare of anything reflective. Exhausted, she collapsed into bed, convinced she'd finally freed herself from whatever curse she'd unleashed. But that night, as the storm raged outside, she heard the familiar knock, this time closer, coming from inside her room. She sat up, clutching her blanket, every nerve in her body screaming to run. But the door creaked open on its own, revealing nothing but darkness. And then she felt the icy touch of fingers running down her shoulder. the mocking whisper filling her ears one last time. "You can't get rid of me. I'm you." The last thing she saw before the darkness closed in was her reflection, twisted and grinning, stepping closer until it consumed everything around her. Lucy was never seen again. But some nights, if you stand in front of a mirror in an old empty house and say her name, you might just catch a glimpse of her, standing silently behind you, smiling that same dark, twisted smile. The small, rural town of Ridgeway had one long-standing tradition. Every December, on the night of the first snowfall, the townspeople would lock their doors, pull down their blinds, and turn off their lights. No one spoke about it openly, but everyone knew the rule. Do not look outside on the first snowfall. Laura, a newcomer to Ridgeway, had heard whispers of the tradition, but dismissed it as local superstition. She just moved to town for a fresh start and found the idea almost charming, like an old ghost story. One cold night in December, as she settled into her new house, the snow began to fall, gently at first and then thicker, swirling down in a silent storm. By midnight, the ground was covered in a fresh, untouched blanket of snow. She decided to make herself a warm drink and watch the snowfall from her window, curious about why the town feared it so much. As she walked toward the window, she heard a faint sound, like a soft lullaby carried on the wind. It was barely audible, but as she strained to listen, the hairs on the back of her neck stood up. She peered outside and saw that the street, usually empty at night, was filled with people she didn't recognize. They were walking down the road in slow, measured steps, all dressed in old-fashioned clothing, a mix of tattered, outdated garments that seemed more suited to the 19th century than today. Their faces were pale, and they moved with an eerie calm, like they were being led by some unseen force. Each figure walked barefoot, leaving no tracks in the snow. Laura felt an urge to call out to them, to ask if they needed help, but something stopped her. Their eyes, they were fixed forward, unblinking, as if they were all in a trance. And then one of the figures, a small girl with hollow, empty eyes, stopped in front of her house, tilting her head up toward the window. She knew instinctively that she shouldn't look, but her curiosity overpowered her fear, and she didn't move, watching as the little girl raised a hand to wave, her mouth twisting into a smile that didn't reach her eyes. Then, in a voice that felt like a cold breath down her spine, the girl spoke. "Come outside, Laura. We've been waiting for you." Laura's blood turned to ice. She hadn't told anyone her name yet. She barely knew anyone in town. Her instinct told her to hide, to turn off the light and pretend she hadn't seen a thing. But as she tried to step back from the window, she felt something cold press against her ankle, holding her in place. Looking down, she saw the faint imprint of a hand, white as snow, closing around her ankle, even though no one was there. Panic surged through her, and she pulled her leg free, stumbling backward. When she looked up, the crowd of people outside had stopped. All of them, every single one, was staring directly at her. Their expressions were blank, eyes unblinking, mouths closed in strange, haunting grins. She felt their gaze like a physical weight pressing on her chest, making it hard to breathe. Suddenly, her phone buzzed, jolting her back to reality. She grabbed it, desperate for any distraction, and saw a message from her neighbor, an older woman named Ruth, who had warned her about the first snowfall. The message was short, but the urgency in the words was unmistakable. "Do not look outside. Turn off your lights now." Her heart hammered as she turned off the lights and backed away from the window. She sank down to the floor, trying to stay as quiet as possible, her hand covering her mouth to stifle her breathing. Outside, she could still hear the faint sound of the lullaby, as if it were calling her to come join them. She stayed hidden, the minutes ticking by like hours, until finally, the music stopped. Silence settled over the house, thick and oppressive, broken only by the sound of her own heartbeat. She didn't dare move, didn't even breathe, until she felt sure they were gone. When she finally stood up and dared to look outside again, the street was empty. There were no footprints in the snow, no sign that anyone had been there at all. It was as if the strange visitors had vanished without a trace. The next morning, Ruth came to check on her. She told Laura that the townspeople who had dared to look during the first snowfall never quite came back the same. They'd become quiet, withdrawn, always staring blankly into the distance, as if they were somewhere else entirely. And a few of them, A few of them were never seen again. Laura tried to put it out of her mind, chalking it up to an unsettling dream. But that night, as she lay in bed, she heard it again. The soft sound of a lullaby, drifting through the snow-covered silence. And then just outside her window, a familiar voice whispered, "Come outside, Laura. Don't you want to join us?" Evan had always heard the stories about Blackwood Trail, a hidden path deep in the woods where people sometimes disappeared. Growing up, his parents had warned him to stay away, saying it was a place where the forest was different. Locals whispered about hikers who went missing, their belongings later found scattered along the path with no sign of them. It was local lore, a ghost story meant to keep children from wandering too far. But one evening in late November, just before winter settled in, Evan decided to go hiking alone. He was drawn to Blackwood Trail, curious about the mystery surrounding it and convinced it was all just a myth. The woods were still and the faint smell of snow was in the air, as if the first flurries were just hours away. After walking for about half an hour, Evan noticed that the forest seemed darker than usual, the shadows deeper, stretching out as though they were moving on their own. The wind picked up, a low, eerie whistle weaving through the trees, making him feel as though he wasn't entirely alone. But he shrugged it off and continued down the path, determined to prove to himself that there was nothing to fear. As he rounded a bend, he spotted something strange on the trail ahead. A small, pale figure was standing in the middle of the path, a child no older than 6 or 7, wearing clothes that looked like they were from another time, maybe the early 1900s. The boy's face was half hidden in shadow, but Evan could see his eyes, dark and hollow, staring directly at him. "Are you lost?" Evan called out, feeling a chill run down his spine as the boy continued to stare without responding. The boy tilted his head slowly, and in a voice that seemed far too deep, he whispered, "You shouldn't be here." A shiver crept over Evan, but he forced himself to keep calm. "Do you need help finding your way out?" he asked, stepping forward. The boy's face twisted into an unnatural smile, and he shook his head slowly. "No, but do you?" Evan hesitated, suddenly unsure. His instincts told him to turn back, to get out of the forest as fast as he could. But the boy just watched him, unblinking, his dark eyes fixed on Evan's every move. And then, without another word, the boy turned and walked off the trail, disappearing into the thick trees. Against his better judgment, Evan followed, unable to shake the feeling that something was drawing him deeper into the woods. The child's footprints were barely visible in the damp earth, leading him into an area he didn't recognize. He looked around, feeling disoriented. He should have been able to hear the sounds of the road or see the faint glow of town lights in the distance, but there was nothing, just dense, endless trees and a thick, unnatural silence. And then he saw it. Scattered around the forest floor were tattered backpacks, coats, and even shoes, all half buried beneath layers of dead leaves and moss, as though they'd been there for years. He recognized a few of the items from missing person posters he'd seen around town. An eerie silence settled over him as he scanned the forest floor, realizing that this was where those who had disappeared on Blackwood Trail had ended up. He backed up slowly, his mind racing, his pulse pounding. But when he turned to leave, he found the path had vanished. Vanished. The trees now seemed impossibly close, pressing in on him from every side, their branches twisting and curling like skeletal fingers. Every direction looked the same, a thick wall of darkness. Then he heard footsteps again, slow and dragging, moving through the leaves behind him. He whipped around, heart racing, only to find the boy standing just a few feet away, watching him with that same twisted smile. "You can't leave now," the boy whispered, his voice echoing strangely like it was coming from all around him. Evan stumbled backward, his throat dry as panic set in. He tried to find his way back, to retrace his steps, but the more he walked, the more the forest seemed to shift around him, closing in, rearranging itself so that he was always drawn back to the same spot, surrounded by the abandoned belongings of those who had come before him. And then he saw others. Shadowy figures began to emerge from the trees, men, women, even children, moving silently toward him. Their faces were pale, their eyes empty, as though the life had been drained from them long ago. They reached out with ghostly hands, their expressions twisted in silent agony. In a panic, Evan broke into a run, stumbling and tripping over roots and rocks, desperately trying to escape. But no matter which way he turned, he always ended up back at that same spot, the abandoned possessions lying scattered like remnants of a lost world. He could feel the shadows closing in, the cold grip of unseen hands reaching out to pull him back. Finally, as he collapsed against a tree, breathless and defeated, he saw the boy standing just a few feet away, his face eerily calm. "You shouldn't have come here," the boy said, his voice barely a whisper. "Now you're one of us." Evan's vision began to blur, darkness creeping in from the edges as he felt himself slipping away, as if the forest itself was swallowing him whole. The last thing he saw was the boy's hollow eyes, watching him with that same cruel smile. Days later, a search party found Evan's car parked at the entrance to Blackwood Trail. They scoured the woods, calling his name, searching for any trace of him. But the only thing they found was a single item lying in the middle of the trail, a faded, mud-stained backpack. And from that day on, the townspeople would whisper about a new figure on Blackwood Trail, a shadowy presence with dark, hollow eyes, watching from the trees, waiting for the next hiker to come along and lose their way.